Star Trek The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 3. Worf and the Brickar sat on opposite sides of the room. With their arms folded sullenly and their legs outstretched, they looked like mirror images of each other. It was not a notion that Worf was particularly happy with. The thought that he might have anything in common with the obnoxious Brickar, including body language. So he shifted his position and crossed his legs. Curiously, the Brickar had started to do the exact same thing. But, seeing that Worf was doing it, he promptly stopped and maintained his posture. They sat that way, unmoving, for what seemed an eternity. They didn't speak to each other, and they even tried not to look at each other. Finally, though, the silence weighed a bit too heavily on Worf's nerves, particularly when it was combined with the image he had in his head of his disappointed parents.
"Why did you do it?"
he demanded. The Brickar looked up at him.
"Do what?"
he said blandly. Worf made a noise of disgust. If the Brickar was going to play some sort of game with him, then Worf had no intention of participating. But now, with the silence broken, the Brickar actually allowed himself a small smile of amusement. "Because I wanted you gone. Because you had no business being here. If it meant sacrificing my own place at the Academy, that didn't matter."
"I have as much business here as you," Worf shot back. "I had not done anything to you."
"Like betray me," said the Brickar, "and now you won't have the opportunity." At first Worf was going to pursue it, but then he saw the resolute, stubborn expression of the Brickar. The same look of hostility and intolerance he'd encountered so many times in the past. Here he had thought it was going to be different. What a tremendous disappointment to see how wrong he was. The two of them said nothing further to each other, and then a door at the far end of the room slid open. A moment later, a senior cadet stepped out. His face was unreadable. More out of courtesy than out of a sense of duty, since both of the young individuals in the room had a suspicion that their Starfleet careers were over before they had begun, they rose and stood stiffly at attention. "The Admiral will see you now," was all the cadet said. Worf and the Brickar moved past him and into the Admiral's office. The office itself was absolutely spotless. Nothing was out of place. Trophies, awards, citations, mementos, all were neatly arranged. Small hollows of the Admiral standing next to a variety of top Starfleet officials lined shelves on the walls. All of them were regarding her with a look of affection. The Admiral sat behind a large desk, her fingers interlaced. The expression on her face left no doubt about how grave the situation was. Her face was round, her hair white. Her eyes were deep set, and her lips were drawn in a thin scowl of disapproval. For a moment, Worf wondered if it was always that way, or whether she was just exceptionally irked for the occasion. As the door hissed shut behind them, she let them stand there for a moment. She studied them, as if trying to decide at this very moment in time just how she was going to dispose of this case. Of course, Worf was quite certain that she knew precisely what she was going to do long before they'd entered. He didn't understand what she was delaying for. How long could it possibly take to say, "You're both gone"? She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never wavering. "Sit down, gentlemen," she said finally. They sat, the tight leather of the Brickar's pants making an odd crinkling sound. "I'm Admiral Fincher, Dean of Students," she said after a moment. "You gentlemen are, and I use the term loosely, cadets." The tone of her voice didn't seem to require or even desire an answer, so they gave none. She shook her head and pushed aside a glowing computer screen. She fixed her gaze on the Brickar. "Zach Keebran," she said. "I did pronounce that correctly?" "Yes, ma'am," he rumbled. "You're only the third Brickar we've had at the Academy. Your test scores were exceptional. Your strength and reflexes were at the peak of the curve." "Well," he said, casting a superior glance at Worf, "we Brickar are, after all, genetically bred for—" "Be quiet," she said firmly. Zach immediately became silent. She turned her eyes toward Worf. "Worf Rozhenko," she said, "our first Klingon." She leaned back, her fingertips pressed against one another. I shipped out with your adopted father, back when we were both space rats just out of the academy. He was quite a man."
"He still is,"
Worf replied. She raised an amused eyebrow, giving the first and only slightest hint that she found any aspect of the situation at all amusing. "My apologies. I didn't mean to speak of him in the past tense." Then she paused and added, "Are you under the impression that my favorable history with your father is going to get you any special favors?"
"No, ma'am."
"Good. Well, gentlemen, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard is that you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. And the two of you have certainly blown that opportunity, eh?" Again she paused, and then she looked over at the computer screen. "It describes here," she said, "the psychological profiles of Cadets Kibran and Rozhenko, which lead inevitably to physical conflict. The Brickar have a historical dislike for Klingons, stemming from rather intense border battles that ensued between the species before the time of the Great Alliance. You must have heard some rather impressive horror stories about Klingons, eh, Kibran?" He did nothing to hide his disgust when he looked at Worf.
"Oh, yes."
Said Fincher neutrally. "And you, Rozhenko, have run into individuals such as Kibran before. You have a history of altercations, making your little slugfest with Kibran here rather impossible to avoid."
"As always, I was provoked,"
Worf said.
"I do not seek battle."
"But you won't walk away from it."
"That would not be honorable."
She said again. She drummed her fingers on her desk.
"With all due respect, Admiral," Worf said, "it is simple to look at the psychological profiles now and say that a fight was inevitable. It would appear to relieve the Brickar of his responsibility in starting it, saying he had no choice due to upbringing."
"Just as you had no choice in your response because of your origins, yes," said Fincher. "Look at the dates on this report, gentlemen." She turned the computer around, and Worf and Zack leaned forward.
2 months ago?"
said Zack. Fincher nodded slowly. "What appeared spontaneous to you gentlemen was something that we saw coming when we first accepted both your applications. The key to being a good Starfleet officer, Kibran, Rozhenko, is anticipating situations before they arise and preparing for them. That's 99% of what we teach here. Preparedness. If you go through life simply reacting to what happens, sooner or later the law of averages is going to catch up with you, and you will be overwhelmed by something you did not anticipate." She leaned back in her chair. "Did you ever hear of the cold equations, gentlemen?" When they shook their heads, she continued, "It's a very famous short story, set during the early days of space-going. Back then, every single pound that a ship was carrying had to be calculated perfectly, because the ship carried only enough fuel to get you where you needed to go. In that story, a teenage girl stowed away aboard a small one-person transport vessel because she wanted to see her brother on a colony world. Once the pilot discovered her, he realized her additional, unanticipated weight was going to eat up the fuel too fast. The result would have been a crashed ship and a lost cargo that the colonists needed. The pilot had no choice but to jettison the girl. She died. The end. Now, it didn't happen. It's just fiction. However, it could very easily happen, given the right circumstances. The point, gentlemen, is that space is a very unforgiving environment. It's cold, it's airless, it is not charitable, and it does not make allowances for such things as bigotry and hostility. The vacuum of space doesn't care about your skin color or your politics or the strength in your arms or the brains in your heads. You've got only two things going for you that can prevent a very swift and very painful death. The first is the integrity of your ship's hull, and the second is each other." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "I admit to some degree of bias here," she said finally. "I would be very, very disheartened to have to send the first Klingon ever to arrive at Starfleet Academy packing mere hours after he got here. That would be a bit of a failure, and failure is not something that I welcome. By the same token, I cannot allow Worf to stay and send you away, Kibran. That would not be fair."
"He started it,"
Worf protested. The Admiral held up a stern finger. "I don't want to hear it," she said flatly. "This is not a schoolyard, gentlemen. This is not a playground. This is Starfleet Academy. Note the absence of playground equipment in the front courtyard. Note the large sign that says Starfleet Academy rather than a sign that reads, "This way to the monkey bars and seesaws." That should have been your first clue. She rose from her chair. Worf was struck by the fact that she was barely over 5 feet tall. It was rather surprising, considering the amount of pure charisma she seemed to radiate. If she'd stood over 6 feet, that would have not surprised him. She circled them slowly. You've only got one thing in your favor. The fact that you have not yet checked in. Technically speaking, you aren't officially cadets until you sign in and register. You were still on your own time, so to speak, when you chose to engage in that disgusting physical display in the courtyard. I can't sanction the action of cadets who weren't cadets at the time of the infraction. Am I correct in assuming that you two would still like to attend this learning institution? They both nodded. Very well, she said. However, as the records indicated, we did have an idea that this altercation might occur. Although even we couldn't have anticipated the speed with which it would happen, nevertheless, having expected it, we were able to make plans as to how to deal with it. Kibran, Rozhenko, look at each other. The Klingon and the Brickar slowly fixed each other with mutual glowers. Gentlemen, she said, you're each looking at your new roommate. It took a moment for what she had said to sink in, and then they both spoke at once. Admiral, with all due respect, this is not going to work. I don't recall giving you gentlemen a choice, she said. There are two questions, of course. The first is, how badly do you wish to remain at Starfleet? The second is, since I take it that you both find the situation intolerable, they nodded in unison. In that case, it's merely a question of which of you is going to resign first. As soon as one of you is gone, the other will have a much easier time of it, not to mention a room to himself. So, which of you is going to quit? The word hung there in the air like a vulture. Neither of the young males quite knew how to react for a moment. Then Worf said firmly, I am not going to quit. I have no intention of leaving, said Zach with equal certainty. Well then, said Fincher brightly, it appears we'll all be one big happy family then. One more such outburst as we endured earlier, however, and you will both be out. I don't care about race, war stories, none of it. To put it in a way that I hope you'll understand, now that you're in our playground, you'll play by our rules. Dismissed. They turned and headed for the door. Oh, and gentlemen, she tossed after them, welcome to Starfleet Academy. Chapter 4. By the time Worf had retrieved his bag from the shuttle pad and arrived at his quarters, Zach Kibran was already there. Zach had unpacked his few belongings. A number of them seemed to be odd pieces of statuary and such, and they had been neatly arranged around the room. Well, not around, actually. They occupied precisely half the room, the right half. Stretched out on his bunk, a rock-like formation that must have been specially ordered for the Brickar, Zach did not even afford Worf a glance when the Klingon entered. Instead, he spoke succinctly, in a manner that indicated he had already thought out precisely what he was going to say. Take careful notice, he said, of the line. And now Worf saw it, a long black line that had been etched down the middle of the room, dividing it perfectly. This side, said Kibran, is my side. The other side is your side. Keep everything of yours, including yourself, on that side, and everything should be fine.
You're serious?
Always, said Kibran. For a moment, Worf considered literally stepping over the line, but he realized that would be provoking a fight. He'd always prided himself on not starting fights, only finishing them. So he walked over to the other side of the room and tossed his suitcases on the bed.
I had hoped, he said, to be rooming with my brother.
I had hoped, replied Zach, not to have to look at a Klingon face for the next several years. We don't all get what we ask for, do we?
What is your problem?
Worf demanded in irritation. My problem? Zach turned, propping himself up on one elbow. My problem, Klingon, is that I know all about your kind.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And how many Klingons have you met, specifically?
Zach frowned. Just you, he admitted. But before Worf could comment on Zach's lack of familiarity with his people, Kibran Keeburn quickly added, "But I've heard plenty. My grandfather told me all about your kind. He told me about the wars. He told me that if you turn your back on a Klingon for a second, you'll find a knife in it. He told me about your evil rituals, about how you drink human blood, and your favorite meal is a human child." Worf was appalled.
"And you believed all that?"
"Are you calling my grandfather a liar?"
"Your grandfather was misinformed,"
Worf said, not seeing any reason to pursue the matter further.
"Tell me, Keeburn, if you're so certain that Klingons are untrustworthy, why did you agree to room with me then?"
"I wasn't exactly given a choice," Keeburn pointed out. "And besides, I'm a very light sleeper. So don't try anything, Klingon, or we'll see just who winds up with a knife in him." Worf went to his closet to put his things away. He discovered several Starfleet cadet uniforms already hanging there. They looked to be precisely his size. He shook his head in amazement. Anticipation indeed. Not only had Admiral Fincher known precisely what she was going to do before she did it, but she had been quite certain of their agreeing to remain in a situation that neither of them thought particularly agreeable. So certain, in fact, that she had had their uniforms in a special bunk in their room waiting for them. He changed into his cadet uniform. This should have been a proud moment for him as he continued the Rozhenko tradition of Starfleet service, but it was marred by the look of disgust he got from Zach.
"I heard things about the Brickar too, you know," said Worf. "Arrogant, high-handed, blustering cowards you're called. I have seen little from you to indicate any of that is an exaggeration. But as for you, you can look around as long as you wish, and you will never see me consuming a human baby."
With that, he walked out and down the hallway to try and find his brother. He felt odd and self-conscious. It had taken him some time to come to terms with the fact that he would be the first Klingon in the halls of Starfleet Academy, but his less than stellar arrival had made him particularly sensitive. Every curious glance that he got, he interrupted as gaping. He interpreted as gaping. Every polite nod or brisk acknowledgement was, he quickly became convinced, merely a means of covering up some sort of hostility. And he knew that he couldn't go on thinking that way. He'd make himself crazy if he did, but he couldn't help himself. "Worf!" He turned to discover Simon, already in cadet uniform, running up behind him. His brother took him by the shoulders. "Here you are! I've been going crazy looking for you."
"I was not hiding."
"I know you weren't," said Simon, with that easy laugh of his that Worf so envied. I checked with the brass, and they told me that you hadn't been thrown out. I was so relieved. Not just for you, mind you," he said half seriously. "I would have hated having to explain to Mama and Papa how I didn't do a good enough job watching out for you. By the way, you missed our orientation speech and tour."
"I was unpacking."
"Your room assignment wasn't posted. Where are you rooming?"
"Section 24, room 7,
said Worf, and he added with obvious distaste,
"They stuck me with the Brickar."
"No, the one you were fighting with?"
"Yes."
Simon shook his head. "Starfleet moves in mysterious ways. I thought we'd be roommates." He shrugged. It's better than getting thrown out, I suppose. Although maybe not by much. Are you going to be okay?"
"I can stand it for as long as he can. Longer,"
he amended. "Okay. Come on. I've got some people in my room I want you to meet."
"Are any of them Brickar?"
"No."
"Lead the way."
Simon led him to his own quarters. The first thing that Worf noticed when the door opened was that there was no line dividing it in half. Somehow that seemed a healthier way to go about things. He also heard several voices all talking at once, but the noise abruptly ceased the moment Worf walked in. He recognized several of the occupants immediately. "You're still here," Salida the Vulcan said with interest. "How very intriguing."
"They acknowledged that I was not at fault,"
Worf said. "More likely," replied Salida. "They did not want to expel the first Klingon to attend the academy, and they could not very well keep you and get rid of the Brickar. What did they do? Room you two together?" Worf tried not to let the astonishment show on his face.
"Yes."
"A logical course of action," she said. Mark over there is my roommate, said Simon, indicating the somewhat spaced Mark McHenry. Mark's expertise is astronavigation. Isn't that right, Mark? Mark was busy making a hand puppet out of one of his socks. Worf stared at him incredulously.
Astronav? Are you serious? He can barely find his way through the normal physical universe, much less chart a path through warp space. Put him at con and he'll crash, while still in dry dock.
Come on, Worf, don't be so hard on the guy. Believe it or not, I heard he's a genius when it comes to... Hi, everyone, said Mark in a high-pitched voice, manipulating the mouth of his improvised puppet. I'm Mark Sock. Or Mock Sock. Whichever.
When it comes to what?
Said Worf dryly to Simon.
Ventriloquism? Bad news, Simon. I saw his mouth move.
All right. And this is Tanya Tobias. Simon stepped aside, and an attractive young woman was just behind him. First thing that Worf noticed about her was her eyes, which were large and shaped like a doe's. She had a small nose, and the general shape of her face could best be described as elfin, as her jaw tapered down to a delicate point. Her skin was quite pale, almost alabaster, and her straight blonde hair just touched her shoulders. How lovely. It's a pleasure to meet you, Worf, she said. She shook his hand firmly.
A pleasure to meet you, too.
We were thinking of forming a study group. I was hoping you might want to join us, Simon told him. What a smashing idea, said Mark's socked hand. Worf cast him a cold glance.
Only if he leaves that in his closet.
Mark stared at the sock for a moment and asked, Can I wear it on my foot?
Yes,
said Worf impatiently. Mark pulled the sock on over his boot. Not out of any attempt to get a laugh, but rather Worf suspected because he simply wasn't paying attention. Worf had the sneaking suspicion that he wasn't going to have to worry too much about McHenry being an irritating presence. With his flakiness, it was likely that he'd be gone inside of a week anyway. Tell you what, said Simon. Let's go down to the food lounge and get something to eat. Then we can go over our various course schedules, get things sorted out, pinpoint our weak spots, that sort of thing. Once again, Worf felt a twinge of mild jealousy for his brother. Since arriving, Worf had managed to get into a wrestling match and be called on the carpet by the dean of students. In the exact same span of time, Simon had organized a study group and was preparing to settle down to the business of getting things done. Worf was lucky to have him. Worf headed for the door and walked out, taking the lead, and the next thing he knew, something hard and metal had clattered down, enveloping his head, cutting off his vision, and worst of all, sending water pouring down his uniform. From behind him came gasps of shock, and from just in front of him was a roar of laughter. Slowly, he pulled the bucket off his head. An upperclassman was standing several feet away, doubled over with laughter, howling in joy. He was lean, with a shock of gray-white hair, and when he spoke, it was with a thick Irish brogue. "Beautiful!" he proclaimed, clapping his hands together in self-delight. "Oh, me great-grandfather, Sean Finnegan, be so proud to know that his great-grandson is keeping alive the family tradition of practical joking. Oh, the jokes he played on young James Kirk will be nothing compared to me. Hi!" Finnegan never saw what was coming, but the next thing he knew, he was regaining consciousness a day later in the infirmary. He had 2 less teeth, a black eye, and a broken nose, and he had to stay off solid foods for a week. He wasn't able to swear out a complaint because he was still dazed and wasn't sure what had happened, nor did anyone else know, or at least no one else was admitting that they knew. He was relatively certain he'd been hit with something hard, like a brick of gold-plated latinum, for example, or a runaway shuttlecraft. Either way, he never quite got up the nerve to pull a practical joke on anyone again, and he made particularly sure to give the whole study group a wide berth from then on.